Our Business Leadership South Africa CEO, Busi Mavuso, says economic growth is being choked by a lack of affordable data bandwidth. She's calling for far greater access to spectrum, saying the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated just how important that is. She joins us now tonight. Good evening, and thank you so much for your time tonight. I think, one of the things in this piece that you've put together just on how much of a stumbling block the issue of spectrum has become for the country's economy is that, I thought that you explained so well just what we have experienced under the COVID-19 pandemic, and in a very real way, how people's lives have been changed just by greater access to spectrum. And it's not something that we actually really think about. And perhaps for the benefit of my viewers as well, if you can just detail some of that change that has taken place during this period, that additional spectrum has been released.
Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me. So the issue at hand, which is really a looming crisis, Kathy, is that under the disaster regulations, ICASA granted additional spectrum to the main operators so that they could cope with the increased data demand, which was created by lockdowns. And the reason why the data demand went high was precisely because all of us found ourselves working from home, which therefore means we were not connecting, from the servers of our own companies. We therefore had to get routers. We were depending on the, home connectivity, and all of those things. So it therefore meant, that the main operators needed, to be granted additional spectrum so that they could cope with this increased data demand. And in return, the operators had to agree to certain conditions, like sending messages on the management and prevention of COVID, like the provision of virtual classroom platforms to support virtual teaching and access to sites. And they actually had to agree, as was required by the Department of Health, that, access to some of the healthcare sites are actually going to have to be, that access is going to have to be made available at no cost, as it were. And they actually, agreed to all those conditions. So as a result of that, tens of thousands of school learners and tertiary students were able to continue their education. Clinics and other healthcare sites, could remain connected. A lot of people have also managed to work from home as a result of this decision. So basically, it would have been impossible to remain connected without this additional spectrum having been granted, and many more jobs would have been lost. And if you look at what happened in the call center industry, you would see that over the last year and a half, this is the one industry that has actually managed to grow. This is the one industry that has actually managed to continue to create jobs. This is the one industry that has actually made a significant boost, to the GDP of the country. And it was therefore a shock when ICASA 2 weeks ago announced that it would be terminating these licenses on the 30th of November, which is about 2 months ago. And 2 months from now. So what it means is that when this temporary spectrum is actually going to be withdrawn, the country is going to face what will be tantamount to digital load shedding, which will cause serious degradation in quality, which means that the conversation that you and I are having online now, Kathy, since we can't come into your, spaces, is actually going to be virtually impossible. So we are saying, therefore, as business, that the timing makes no sense. The pandemic is still with us, and we remain in a state of disaster. And the original regulations noted, that the spectrum would be made available until 3 months after the end of the state of disaster. So the impact to consider, therefore, from where we're sitting is that there is going to be a serious effect on the vulnerable. The remote learning program that is set to reach about 1.2 million learners is not going to be achieved. The free SMSs that you and I are getting, in communicating to the Department of Health after we've registered for our vaccination programs, to remind us that we're going to have to get our jabs tomorrow, or whatever the case is, all of that is going to have to be taken away. 5 million people that are currently benefiting from these free services are actually not going to benefit, anymore. But also, when you look at the adjusted level 2 conditions, it says that people should continue to work from home. And that will no longer be possible if ICASA withdraws the temporary spectrum, which means that all of us are going to have to be forced to go back to offices. And with the slow vaccine uptake on the other side, this will mean increased health risks. So let's agree that we therefore could be facing the fourth wave, shortly after November. That is actually going to be an own goal created deliberately, intentionally by ICASA, by the decision that they've chosen to make of withdrawing the temporary spectrum. So we are therefore raising this issue to say it's going to have to get the president's attention. It doesn't make sense. Kathy, we keep on talking about how we need to position this country as an investment destination, but this undermines our economic recovery agenda. The president was talking in Limpopo about 2 weeks ago, talking about, I think it was at an investment conference, talking about the fact that South Africa is open for business. Well, that is not true. We are not. Not when ICASA is going to make a decision like this. Not when we continue to talk left and walk right as a country. Not when we set a clear path of what needs to be done to change our economic trajectory, but we continue to make decisions that are actually going to undermine that path and that trajectory. It doesn't make sense when you're actually sitting with unemployment rate of 44.4%, in terms of the expanded definition. This means that a whole lot more people are probably going to be losing their jobs. Our education system that is already under severe strain, it means that these kids that are not in a position to go to school on a daily basis are not going to be benefiting from the virtual classrooms. So we are raising the question of what is the thinking, and have we really thought about the unintended consequences of what this decision is going to make?
Of course, one of the biggest difficulties now is the fact that the case about the auctioning of spectrum and the different licensing requirements for various players, that is still in the courts. So even if ICASA were to argue that, well, we need to suspend this emergency spectrum so that we can actually get to the actual licensing process, nobody knows how long this court case is going to take. I think there hasn't been a State of the Nation address that President Cyril Ramaphosa has given that has not included the issue of spectrum and the release of additional spectrum, and yet we're still here.
That is precisely the point. I think the main key issue here is that this temporary spectrum was issued under the COVID-19 pandemic, under the disaster, a regulation, or management act that we are actually still undergoing as a country. So if the agreement was that this is going to be removed or be taken back or be withdrawn 3 months after, the state of disaster is no more, what is there for the agency? As you rightfully say, Kathy, this issue is still sitting at the courts. We have actually reached a stalemate, which was announced, I think, last month sometime, when we thought that we were actually going to have a breakthrough. We have just changed ministers in this, department and in this ministry. The minister still has to actually get her head around the issues and see how she can actually meaningfully intervene. So all of that has not been achieved. So if the government, if the president is not going to intervene, in this gazette by ICASA, it's really going to be disastrous. I worry about how we seem hell-bent as a country in the decisions that we're making, to actually continue to cause significant investor anxiety. And when you look at what happened to the markets when ICASA actually issued this gazette, you would see that billions of rands were actually wiped off the market. It doesn't make sense. On the one hand, we have an Operation Vulindlela that is actually trying its best to deal with the acceleration of the implementation of the critical structural reforms. But on the other hand, you've got a regulator that is running amok. It cannot be. So I think the frustration from where we are sitting is that the environment within which we are operating, Katie, is being made difficult on a daily basis. We keep on saying that we need to do more so that we can change the livelihoods, of the millions of South Africans that actually find themselves under difficult conditions at the moment. But the decisions that we're making as a country are actually not pointing in that direction. So I think the issue here is precisely that. What exactly is the thinking? And come 1st of December, Katie, what exactly is going to happen?
What happens next in terms of how Business Leadership South Africa is going to be taking this matter on?
So we are actually, starting this conversation. We have requested an engagement with the minister so that we can understand, what her thinking is, so that if she has to understand if they've had this conversation with the regulator, and if they've had the conversation, what is the regulator saying? Is the Minister Nkosazana Zuma has she been brought to the discussion? And since she's the one who actually holds the Disaster Management Act, and if she has been brought into the discussion, can she not override, the ICASA decision? Because she's actually got the powers to override the ICASA decision to say that the conditions under which you issued this temporary spectrum were very clear. So those conditions are still there. The environment within which we issued the spectrum is still, existing. We still work in this virtual and online environment, and we need intervention in as far as that is concerned. I'm worried that the socio-economic impact, of this decision is really going to be devastating. I'm really worried of the impact, of what this is going to do, to businesses, what this is going to do to an already battered and ailing economy. We keep on talking about the fact that our economic growth has not reached 2%, since 2013. Now we want to make a decision which will definitely ensure, Kathy, that we don't, reach the over 2% mark by making these decisions that actually do not make sense. So I think the reason why we're starting the conversation is to really bring it to the government's attention, not that they are not aware, but to say that, do you see the agency that we are seeing as business? Do you understand the implication of what is about to happen? We've got an opportunity to actually avert this looming disaster. We've got 2 months to deal with it. Can someone call ICASA into order? Can someone talk sense into the regulator and make them see the implications of their decision? Because we are worried that it's been 3 weeks and yet nothing has been said about it.
Of course, to a large extent, in order for one to truly appreciate what you as a business are saying, then one would have to go back to perhaps a bit of what life was like before the release of this emergency spectrum. And what about those who think, well, a bit of delays here, a bit of still loading there, buffering is not so bad to deal with?
When you look at how our networks are currently operating, or the bandwidth is currently operating, when you get into these business meetings, most of us actually have to turn their cameras off, especially if there's going to be a presentation, because if we don't turn our cameras off, the chances of the bandwidth holding, are actually very minimal, which already shows you, the traffic jams that are actually happening on that front, which already shows you, that the bandwidth is under severe strain, under the current circumstances. So I think and with the additional spectrum having actually been issued, so if that is withdrawn, you can really see what the serious impact of that is actually going to be. But I think the one thing that ICASA also is neglecting to look at is that the impact of their decision is really going to be on the end user. This is bigger than the Vodacom and the MTN. And if this is yet another stick, probably maybe that they are using towards a Telkom and a Vodacom and an MTN, well, the news flash is that it's not only going to affect Vodacom, MTN, and Telkom, it's actually going to affect the end user. It's going to affect how you and I run our businesses. It's going to affect the very conversation that we're actually having. It's going to affect, a critical areas of the economy that cannot afford, to be interrupted at the moment. So ICASA really needs to proceed with caution when it comes to this. It needs to work in the best interest of the consumers, the very people who have been worst hit with job losses because of the pandemic. So if we were to actually face more jobs being shed precisely because of ICASA's decision, which could have been averted, Kathy, it would actually be unfortunate. So ICASA really needs to reconsider the withdrawal of this temporary spectrum to, ensure that while we are under the pandemic, we continue to actually ensure that the country is functioning in the manner that it's actually supposed to function, and as I'm saying, the real losers are actually going to be the ordinary South African who stands to lose, quality, speed, and value, and those millions of school children who actually are currently benefiting from the virtual classrooms at the moment.
CEO of Business Leadership South Africa, Busi Mavuso, will certainly follow up on the story and also find out from ICASA and the department what is the next steps where this is concerned.